So does eating meat damage your heart health? A lot of people wonder whether red meat consumption damages their heart health, and we're going to take a look at the science today to find out what's really going on. Every year, about 800,000 Americans die from a heart attack, and heart disease is the leading cause of death worldwide. And the fact that the leading cause of death worldwide is not constantly front page news is baffling to me. With this current pandemic, about 4.5 million people have died since it began, whereas in the exact same period worldwide, heart disease has taken 27 million people's lives. Now, in terms of the debate about heart disease, we know what works, and we know quite clearly that things like exercise, reducing smoking, eating a healthy diet, being a healthy body weight, and reducing stress all contribute to a lower risk of coronary artery disease. But what about red meat? There's been a lot of stuff recently in the media about whether red meat may increase your risk of heart disease, but what does the actual science say? This video series is going to be a multi-part series on heart disease and red meat consumption, as well as fat intake and the mechanisms of lipid transport that actually cause coronary artery disease and plaque development in our heart. So I welcome you to the series and I hope you learned something from it. It is going to be quite a number of videos, so if you don't want to watch all of them, just you can pick and choose which ones you do want to watch. But I really want to cover the entire thing so that people who do want to watch from start to end have the entire education and actually understand what is going on. So just quickly, part 1 is going to be study design and the 2 hypotheses of heart disease. Part 2 is going to be looking deeper into these hypotheses and looking at whether fat intake is actually correlated to heart disease. Part 3 is then going to be linking this back to red meat consumption and seeing if red meat is actually the driver behind some form of heart disease. Part 4 is then going to look at cancer and see if meat consumption is linked to cancer. And then part 5 is just going to be my final thoughts and conclusions about how you lead a healthy and happy life without worrying too much about heart disease, but also minimizing your risk of heart disease issues as you get older. Now, before we get to the research, we just need to understand what the actual studies are trying to do and how they're designed. So in science, there are 2 main ways that you can set up a study. That's experimental and observational. Now, observational studies basically takes a population and looks at what happens when they're exposed to a certain risk factor over time, but they don't have direct ability to actually manipulate that risk factor. So the researchers might just say, okay, we have a population of 20,000 people, half of them have eaten meat for the past 10 years and half of them have not eaten meat, and we're going to basically look at what has happened to the people who have eaten meat and haven't eaten meat and whether there's any differences between the groups. And this is in direct contrast to the other type of study, which is an experimental study, where the researchers have a direct ability to say, okay, we have 20,000 people here. We're going to give 10,000 of them meat for a period of however long, and we're going to have 10,000 of them consume no meat at all. And so in other words, the researchers in an experimental study have direct control over the population and have direct control of what they put in, as in what variables they want to put in, like red meat, and what then they study from that actual population. So they can then control for risk factors, study the variables they want, and then also investigate what has actually happened in their controlled experimental study. And you see, that's the problem with observational studies, is that the scientists only have an ability to actually look at what has occurred, not actually manipulate variables to see what happens. And in observational studies, there are so many factors that you can't account for. Imagine trying to say, okay, over the past 10 years, we're going to look at 10,000 people who have eaten meat, but we don't know what they've been eating over the past 10 years. We don't know whether they might have eaten other things or been smoking or had other risk factors or, variables that can contribute to heart disease that they were doing over those 10 years that the researchers just can't account for because observational studies are just limited in that nature. And plus, who the hell remembers what they ate for the previous 10 years? I can't even remember what I ate last week, let alone for the previous 10 years. So that's already a flaw. And the other final problem is there might be a bias, as in people who eat red meat might be more prone to engage in other behaviors. So they might be, they might go out more and eat more or drink more rather than people who don't eat meat, who might, follow a more healthy diet. So that's the other thing that in observational studies, the researchers can't really account for, is the problem that observational studies are just a bit vague in nature. You can't really get an accurate representation of exactly what's going on because you can't really control them. And so with all these millions of variables happening, determining causation is almost impossible to do. But then the issue is experimental studies are not really practical either, because you can't really really set up a huge study for 10 years because, let's face it, heart disease and cancer, take decades to come on from young adulthood all the way to elderly adults. It may take decades, 5, 6, 7 decades for cancer to actually appear. So the latency period of these diseases is very, very long. And you can't really have an experimental study going on for, 7 decades because firstly, no one's going to sign up for that. And secondly, it's going to cost millions, if not billions of dollars to get this over a wide population of people. It's just not practical at all. So then we're left with the question, well, what the hell do we do? Observational studies are not really perfect research, and yet experimental studies are just impractical to perform for things like heart disease and cancer. So the best that we can do really is take the two converging lines of evidence, put them together and see what both of them say in conjunction with each other.
Why not both?
Now, in terms of heart disease, there are two main lines of thinking, which are essentially the two lines of hypothesis of heart disease. And they are the heart to diet hypothesis and the lipid hypothesis. The heart to diet hypothesis is the idea that what we take in, so our fatty acids and cholesterol that we take in from our diet, sticks to the walls of our arteries over many, many years. And high levels of fat intake over these years actually will increase the plaque development in our arteries. So the idea is that by reducing our fat intake from our diet, we are essentially protecting ourselves a little bit against how much plaque can develop. And the lipid hypothesis builds upon this and essentially is the idea that by reducing the cholesterol in our blood, by whatever means possible, diet or statins, that we can then directly reduce our cardiovascular risk. Thank you for watching part 1, guys. In part 2, we'll be delving into these two hypotheses in more detail, looking at the research behind them and seeing then in part 3, 4, 5 and onwards, we will see whether meat actually can cause heart disease and cancer and whether you guys should be doing anything about it. Thank you so much for watching part 1, guys. I really appreciate all the support from you guys. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.